All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel, or if it's your first time joining us, welcome for the first time. Today, as you can see and know from the title, I'm going to be talking about naturalizing neo-paganism. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, but broadly speaking, we're going to be talking about the subtitle I have here, a properly scientific spirituality, way to practice religion and have a spiritual life, even if you're a person who's disenchanted by that or disenchanted by how it's often practiced or presented, but you still feel some sort of draw to have this kind of ritual or religious life, as some people do, but then become disenchanted with, say, modern Western Christianity. So if that's you, I want to talk a little bit about how to sketch a viable alternative religious tradition by looking back at the old religions. And this is a movement that's coming about, this neo-paganism, but I want to talk about a way to make it a viable alternative for naturalists, broadly speaking, people who place a strong emphasis on science informing their beliefs about ontology. So people who aren't going to be inclined to believe in things like gods or spirits or jotuns or animism or things like this, which can be kind of infused in pagan communities. So you kind of have this problem for naturalists, but I'm going to talk a little bit about a way to maybe solve it. So let's start with, very briefly, what is neo-paganism? Of course, the term neo meaning new. This is just new paganism. So it's a new religious movement that's characterized by a revival of ancient polytheistic traditions and religion, spiritual practices, pretty self-explanatory. So paganism is broadly just referring here to the pre-Christian religious beliefs and practices of various cultures. So a lot of European. So of course, I'll be talking, as it says here, mostly about Norse paganism, but there's also, of course, the Roman pantheon, the Greek, and even some in the Middle East. And as I said, so I'll be talking mostly about neo-paganism in the Norse tradition, which is often called heathenry, Odinism, Asatru, or just Norse paganism. I prefer the term heathenry or just Norse neo-paganism, although Norse isn't always the best scholarly term to use for that period and those people. So heathenry is probably the best, because Asatru is just referring to the Aesir, and a lot of Norse pagans also worship the Vanir in some sense. And Odinism isn't completely inaccurate, because Odin's advice in the Havamal forms a lot of the kind of ethical side of this practice. But that's just, Odinism sounds like it's just about one god, and there's a whole pantheon there. So heathenry is probably the best term, although the only problem being that it's sometimes co-opted by atheists online who are just trying to be edgy, and that's a problem on its own. But yeah, heathenry, Norse neo-paganism, Asatru, Odinism, all these terms, roughly speaking, refer to the same thing. Another problem with the term Asatru is it being sort of connected to the Asatru Folk Assembly, which is a neo-Nazi organization that I and anyone else interested in this completely repudiate as disgusting and not part of the tradition, especially considering how progressive the actual Norse writings are. And as I said, I'll be focusing on this because it personally interests me the most and I've looked into it the most, but you can take note that I'll be talking pretty broadly about paganism. So a lot of what I'm going to say, sure, could also apply to, say, if you're more interested in the Roman pantheon or the Greek or what have you. This is just the one I'm interested in and know the best. And I've kind of actually read some of their documents and such. So why would this interest naturalists? Well, the short answer is maybe it won't for some of you. Some people just, you don't at all have a desire or feel this draw to have a spiritual or ritualistic or religious, whatever you call it, side of your life. Maybe that's just not something that you're concerned with. And I'll be honest, that's how I am most days. But the problem being that our species is sort of, perhaps it is a species problem, that Homo sapiens are just kind of ingrained to have this religious drive because it helped us make sense of the world in our early evolution. But whatever the reason may be, there people sometimes often have these religious experiences, or they have religious drawings towards something other, something spiritual, for lack of a better term. And if their only alternative, this is something Eric Steinhardt's talked about, one way the discourse has gone with New Atheism is to describe, there's this Christianity which is offering you that spiritualism, and then atheists are saying that the alternative is getting rid of meaning and all that, and in that kind of meaning in any sense, And that's what part of what we're trying to combat here, is to say that no, they're all viable alternatives for people who want to reject, say, the Christian view of things. And this is what I was getting at earlier. Problem being is that naturalists generally, as I said, use science to help guide their formation of ontologies. They don't tend to have patience for pseudoscience, or more accurately, non-science, things like horoscopes, astrology, tarot cards, chakras, Reiki, crystal healing, any of that. We don't believe in magic, any woo-woo shit, for lack of a better term. But a lot of pagans seem to be enamored with this, especially, say, Wiccans. So this is kind of the problem that's faced by naturalists, is you have, on one hand, some atheists telling you that, there's no viable religious alternative at all. So it's either Christianity, or it's to go down the road of this. You'll find even some atheists kind of becoming enamored with this New Age, I guess would be the proper way to talk it, this New Age healing and kind of nonsense. And so it's like, what is the alternative? How do I can't accept Christianity. I can't accept believing in this magic crap. Well, what is there left? Well, here's where the naturalizing part comes in. Paganism is a viable alternative, which we'll get to in a second. It's a viable religious and spiritual tradition that can be ritualistically practiced by people, but it can also be made reconcilable with a completely and properly scientific worldview. And that allows you to connect with nature in a way that makes sense. Let's talk about this. So what is the alternative then to these all these bad options? Well, paganism seems like it is the way to go, because it's a religious tradition that faces a lot of emphasis on people and their actions, and often ideas about the afterlife aren't stressed quite as much as they are in, say, monotheistic religions. And there's also usually a pretty strong emphasis on connecting with the earth, especially in the traditions of like what's coming out now called atheopaganism. So let's talk a bit about heathenry, for example, the one I said I'm going to talk about and focus on because I know the best. There's a whole worked out ethic there, a particular one to that tradition that has its own kind of philosophy and emphasizes hospitality, friendship, honor, duty, and it's sort of this display of a particular worldview about fate, kinship, morality. It's not just some aesthetic draw to like, being a Viking bro. It's like, no, there is a coherent and interesting kind of moral and ethical philosophy that connects here at a deep way. And actually, it's been pointed out that the heathen view of life and their view of morality is really pretty similar to Aristotle's virtue ethics. There's a book that I'll mention again at the end of this video in resources called Paganism as a World Religion, that has a chapter on heathenry, Norse Neo-Paganism. So paganism is pretty good about emphasizing nature and our connecting with the natural world, and that being a big part of the ritual and practice. And so you don't have to believe that we can affect the natural world through magic or prayer or call thunderstorms down. But there is an important, completely naturalistic point to be made here, I think, philosophically, that paganism can help ground us in, which is that, it's this monistic view of that we're all made up of the same things as the rest of the world. We're just physical, natural beings. And so this is a properly scientific way of looking at people as being in a really an important sense interconnected with the world. So connecting with that and remembering that through this kind of ritualistic practice, I think can be a good exercise in self-understanding. And then, of course, in heathenry and as far as in paganism in general, there's usually various kinds of rituals. So at the solstices, there's what's called blots, sometimes where there are druids, and there's sort of singing, chanting, offerings to be made, fires. And so it's, of course, a big part of this practice that there are prayers, and a lot of people make altars inside their homes and outside, and they sacrifice to the gods, and they pray. And I think that, and this will make even more sense given some of the things I'm going to say in the next slide, but doing this kinds of thing like praying to the quote unquote gods and forming altars, these can be understood as reflective self-meditations. And when we worship the gods, quote unquote, so when you're praying or worshiping Thor or Freya, this is really an exercise in contemplating character traits that you admire. This is an exercise, a very spiritualistic exercise in self-understanding. And so this is, in an important sense, ritualistic, and in an important sense, I think it's fair to say that it's religious and that it's spiritual, but it doesn't commit you to believing in the existence of these gods or any other spooky magic kinds of entities or forces being out there in the world. It's a way that's, in an important sense, religious, but it doesn't require you to add anything to your ontology or to believe in kind of weird causal forces. So this is really one of the key points of how a lot of this point about nature and connecting with it, this self-meditation, connecting with the world, but also an ethical self-understanding is a big part of spirituality. So it's not right to tell people to just suppress those feelings if they're feeling them. Maybe you don't have them. So this is a way to be religious, to practice a religion and to honor and venerate certain patrons, say, but it doesn't require that you believe anything spooky or weird. What about the gods, though? Maybe you do feel like you should believe in the gods. So I got good news for you on this point. So heathens and pagans in general, they run the gamut from just total old school supernaturalist atheists and the views in between. What do I mean by that? There are plenty of pagans, and in fact, possibly a majority, probably a majority, that do believe in the gods. They believe the gods are actual beings that inhabit the world in much in the same way that we do, that they walk around and they have thoughts and feelings and affect the course of things. But of course, they probably have different abilities than us. They're not just other Homo sapiens. So there are people that are just old school supernaturalists in the sense that they would look at the gods the same way people in antiquity did. It's just real beings out there. And then there, of course, it runs the gamut all the way to atheists, people who, as I was kind of sketching in the last slide, don't believe at all in the gods, and in fact are pretty convinced they don't exist, but still practice the same religion. And this is why paganism, one of the really good things about paganism is you can practice it individualistically, or socially. But even if you do practice it socially, you're going to have you could have a pretty diverse range of beliefs within a community of pagans, but you're still connected through a common moral philosophy and ethical self-understanding in a way that matters and can connect you, even if you disagree on certain ontological points. So I've been talking mostly in this video in atheistic terms. But what if you feel really strongly that the gods exist? I've talked to a few people online in pagan circles who really do feel pretty strongly that the gods have given them signs or answered their prayers or appeared to them in dreams. And of course, I would probably interpret these things the same way I do all religious experiences, just as functions of our brains that don't really mean anything. But that's not to discredit anyone's experience. I can't, I shouldn't tell you what to extrapolate from an experience you had because I haven't had it. So if you do end up feeling really strongly that, say, you're looking into paganism and you feel like Odin has given you a sign, isn't a raven to you, or Freya comes to you in a dream or something, or Thor beats his hammer and there's lightning striking, you just really feel like these gods do exist. And you don't panic if you've been previously a naturalist. This doesn't really logically commit you to a form of non-naturalism. It's completely possible in the sense that it's not really contradictory or obviously problematic to believe that the gods exist in the world as we do, physically embodied beings, but they're completely natural beings, completely physical, material, whatever you want to say. In fact, some Latter-day Saints believe this with respect to God, and I have a friend who believes this. He's more of a naturalist reductionist than I am, but he's a Christian who believes in God. And so you could believe this. You could believe that the gods exist in the world, but they're just physically embodied beings. I mean, the exact sketch of how you want to work that out, they're obviously going to be contingent beings. Maybe they evolved, maybe they're aliens of some sort. That probably wouldn't be a very religious take on it. Probably wouldn't want to worship aliens. So I'm not gonna say exactly what this sketch would look like. The important point being that the important part here is that a naturalized religious practice is cutting out woo nonsense, these spooky magic type views. And in this, I would maybe include something like substance dualism. I mean, the kind of one of the important parts, I think, of having an ontological naturalism is it being monistic. And so as long as this monism is preserved with your postulation of the gods, it can still probably be considered naturalistic. The view can be fully properly scientific, but maybe it includes gods, however you work that out, and that can be fine. Again, I know people who are more eliminativist than I am about consciousness and still believe in God. So that's an option for you as well. It's not one I wouldn't ever probably take, but it's not logically contradictory, and it may be important. So in summation here, I would like to say that I hope I would recommend a few resources for this. So the book I mentioned earlier, which is published, I believe, by Palgrave, is called Pagan Ethics, Paganism as a World Religion. And there's an entry on Norse Neo-Paganism, but there are plenty of other entries as well. A good introduction to atheistic Norse heathenry is this blog post, Why I'm a Godless Heathen, by the Boxing Pythagoras blog. It's a pretty short but interesting, sketches out a lot of what I've been saying pretty well. I would also highly recommend Eric Steinhardt's website, his YouTube channel, his interviews, some of the papers. He has one interview on this channel with myself and my friend Joe Schmid. And I would check out a few of his YouTube videos on paganism. He kind of says he's been helpful for me in thinking about this as far as the need for a kind of spirituality for naturalists that is sketched as a viable alternative. And then if you're interested in particularly the Norse stuff, I would say Ocean Keltoy on YouTube has some good videos on ritual and practice and worship of the gods in Norse paganism, but maybe that could probably apply to other paganisms as well. And then one book that I think is really good just for paganism in general, but is particularly focused on the Norse tradition, is this book, Ausatru for Beginners by Matthias Nordvig. I already said that Ausatru is not a term that all heathens use. That's fine. He discusses that in the book. The book took me only like a couple hours to read, but it's very good because it does a good job of sketching this general pagan view, and he really emphasizes some of the things I talked about as far as the breadth of the tradition, as far as you're kind of free to believe a lot of what you want. It's not a rigid system at all. It was not ever meant to be. So he talks even in their book about how you can believe in the gods, or you don't have to, but you don't have to believe in the gods to be this kind of pagan. And I think it was a really helpful book for me, informing some of my views, and also just being familiar with neo-paganism and how it's practiced. He goes into some of the rituals, like the blots and sacrifices to the gods and the altars and such, and the runes. So that's a really good book, particularly for the Norse stuff, but just in a general understanding of paganism and how broad it can be, how fluid, but also how dynamic and interesting of a spiritual practice it can be. It's a good book. And then if you're interested in reading the foundational text of the heathen tradition, it would just be the Havamal. Jackson Crawford has a translation of it that I've heard is very good. I just read the version in the Oxford published Poetic Edda, which is kind of one of the foundational texts for learning about Norse mythology. So yes, hopefully this was helpful in terms of getting some footing as far as how to sketch out a properly scientific religious practice. And I hope that it's been helpful for you. And thanks for watching.